Hi, welcome to another episode of Humanism Today, the podcast where we dive into ideas, stories, and conversations that inspire humanists, freethinkers, and like-minded people. This podcast is presented by the Humanists and Freethinkers of Fairfield County in Connecticut. Our motto is compassion and reason. Compassion means that we care about all people and their rights regardless of their status in society or their personal condition. Reason means that we use science, facts, logic, and scientific methods to find the truth. This episode is titled A Conversation with Charles Darwin. Mr. Darwin, also known as Professor Kenneth Noll, will discuss his discoveries versus the thinking of British and American scientists of his time. He will cover the scientific evidence gathered on the Beagle's second voyage and its effects on 19th century science.
Hello, everyone. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Kenneth Noll, who is going to speak as Charles Darwin. For many years, Ken Noll has portrayed Charles Darwin in museums, schools, community events, and universities. He depicts Mr. Darwin as a relatable man in presentations about his personal life, his family, scientific activities, and his time. We've asked him to talk about British and American scientists during Darwin's life and his impact. Dr. Kenneth Noll is a professor emeritus of microbiology at the University of Connecticut. Born in Ohio, he went to University of Illinois for graduate school, where his area of research was the evolution and physiology of bacteria that grow at temperatures up to the boiling point of water. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ken Noll and Mr. Darwin to speak with us.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation to come here and speak with you. And apparently I'm speaking with some more people, so I don't quite understand this apparatus here, but I understand there are about twice as many people to whom I'm speaking this evening. And so thank you so much. So as was said, the title of my presentation this evening is I'll be talking about British and American scientists of my time, and also materials I brought back from the voyage of the Beagle, and what was the reception of my ideas and studies with those materials. If you don't mind, I'm going to put on my spectacles because my eyesight is not what it was when I was a younger man. It will help me to see things here. Right, in a slight sip of water. All right, to begin. I was a very inexperienced naturalist when I boarded the HMS Beagle. I was charged with collecting geological and zoological samples in all the areas that the Beagle visited. Our voyage was tasked with mapping the South American coast to take measurements of local time relative to the time at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. I used my collections to help create my geological and biological theories after I returned home. The Royal Navy used the chronological measures to create a means to determine longitude more accurately. These chronological data were well received by experts in that field. My theories, though, received more mixed receptions by my fellow naturalists and by the public. The Beagle had sailed on its first voyage in 1826 to map the southern shoals of South America. My voyage, its second, set out to complete that geographical and hydrographical survey. It was also the first voyage to take accurate time measurements around the world to get better information for longitude determination. The measures of longitude of sites in South America were inconsistent at that time. To that end, we had 22 chronometers aboard, 17 of which Captain Robert Fitzroy purchased from his own funds because the Admiralty thought 5 would suffice. To give an example of how particular Fitzroy was about his work, when we returned to England, he compared the time on his chronometers with those in Greenwich, since we had completely circled the globe. They should have shown the same time, though 24 hours different. In fact, Fitzroy's measurements exceeded this by 33 seconds, which is equivalent to just 8.25 nautical miles longitude difference. Fitzroy, was unsatisfied and considered the error to be inexplicably large. Despite what I came to be known for, I was more experienced in geological studies when I started the voyage. This was ironic considering how much I despised my courses in geology at Cambridge University. However, I studied geology on an expedition through Wales with Professor Adam Sedgwick just before I was asked to join the voyage, and that experience proved vital to my work abroad. I was also given the first volume of the newly published work, Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell, by Captain Fitzroy. From that book, I learned that the world was slowly changing and that all the processes that formed the Earth are still continuing today. I first saw Lyell's principles in action at our first port of call on the island of Santiago in the Cape de Verde Islands. Here I saw evidence of uplifting as seen by a band of white stone formed by the shells of creatures that had lived on the shore. This was reminiscent of the evidence of rising and falling land that Lyell had seen at the Temple of Serapis. I carried this memory with me as I interpreted geological formations on the rest of my voyage. I saw evidence for flooding in Patagonia. I saw evidence of massive uplifting to form the mountains of Chile. I saw dramatic evidence of the processes that caused this uplifting when I experienced an earthquake and its aftermath near Concepcion, Chile. I saw that this one earthquake lifted the shoreline as much as 10 feet in some places. Imagine millennia of earthquakes along with gradual lifting causing the raising of the Andes Mountains. I had these processes in mind. Yes. As I stood on the summit of Otaheite, looking at the adjacent island of Aimeo. The island, with the exception of one small gateway, was completely encircled by a reef. At this distance, a narrow but well-defined, brilliantly white line was alone visible, where the waves first encountered the wall of coral. The mountains rose abruptly out of the glassy expanse of the lagoon, including within this narrow white line, outside of which was the heaving waters of the ocean that were dark-colored. The view was striking. This encircling barrier reef reminded me of the atolls we had seen as we sailed through the South Pacific. Could these two kinds of reef be related? Could the rising and falling land that I had observed in South America account for the atolls? Could the rising of the Andes have been accompanied by the sinking of the floor of the Pacific Ocean? I got a chance to examine reefs up close when we visited the Keeling Islands in Indonesia. I found the coral close to the shore and on the inner and outer faces of the barrier reefs were very different from each other. Here I began to develop my theory of the development of coral reefs. I came to believe that corals form on the rims or sides of volcanoes that slowly sink. The corals continue to grow up as the volcanoes sink, and eventually the island sinks beneath the waves. The coral continues to grow to stay in shallow, lighted water, thus forming an atoll. Well, after I returned, I published this theory in my first book with the support of my new mentor and friend, Charles Lyell. My theory was generally accepted, and it was most notable that Lyell was very supportive. Like many geologists, he had believed that atolls formed on the rims of sunken volcanoes. That theory, however, could not explain how so many such volcanoes all had their rims at just the right depth to support the growth of coral. The only major objection to my theory was that it was based on little supporting evidence for the subsidence of volcanoes. I had gathered evidence of subsidence, but some thought it was not enough. After my death, Alexander Agassiz objected to my theory, but his idea never gained very many supporters. I must report that someone has told me that very recently my theory was tested and found to be correct. However, more recently, others have discovered that in fact, that's only a partial explanation for the formation of atolls. Apparently, sea levels change quite dramatically over time, such that these inundations that occur not only occur by the sinking of the volcanoes, but also by the fluctuations in the sea levels as well. So there's two causes for this, but my cause is still at least part of it. While surveying the eastern coast of South America, the Beagle stopped at many ports along the coast. I frequently spent my time on shore, on short excursions along the coast or longer treks inland. At these times, I collected fossils. Now, to dig out the larger ones, I was assisted by men from the ship's crew. They also assisted me in bringing them back to the ship and packing them away and storing them below decks, as illustrated by the ship's artist, Mr. Earl. This fellow right here is me. I was not always dressed that way, perhaps on Sundays, but he's exaggerating a bit there. Now, the crew was not always pleased with my collections. First Lieutenant John Clements Wickham once said, "There's no such thing as walking the deck for all these cursed specimens. If I had my way, all your damned mess would be chucked overboard and you after it, old flycatcher." In the end, I collected fossils of 13 species of mammals. Among these were 4 different species of giant ground sloth, an elephant-like mammal, an extinct form of hoofed animal, and the remains of an extinct horse. My fossils made a more complete picture of early mammals in South America. I used them to help develop my theory of evolution. I saw in them a continuity of the kinds of animals from these large forms to the smaller modern-day forms, all unique to South America. I called this the law of succession of types. My South American travels also allowed me to collect specimens of living animals. I collected over 1,500 species, mostly in South America. These included insects, fish, shells, reptiles, amphibians, mice, foxes, and birds. These were stored as pelts or bones or whole animals in bottles of spirits. I attempted to classify everything I collected using numerous reference books in the library on the Beagle. I found a most interesting bird on the pampas of South America. I called it an ostrich, but it was really a rhea. It was a flightless bird, smaller than the African ostrich. I had seen many of these birds running about on the pampas, and they were hunted by the gaucho horsemen living there. When we traveled south to Patagonia, the gauchos told me of a smaller kind of rhea that lived there. Though I searched for this lesser rhea, I could never find it. When we docked at Port Desire, the ship's artists, we had 2 artists, Mr. Earl and also Conrad Martins, he had shot a bird and it was prepared for our evening meal. While we were eating it, I realized that this small bird was likely the kind of bird that I had been looking for. So I managed to collect its remaining bones, including its head, its neck, legs, and 1 wing, as well as many of the larger feathers. I packaged it up, included it with other collections on a shipment to Professor John Henslow in Cambridge, who was keeping my shipments of collections. I later met in Patagonia, a Patagonian native who told me that the smaller rheas were the only species this far south, while the larger ones kept to the north. The remains I had gathered were examined by the ornithologist John Gould, who identified them as that of the lesser rhea, and he classified the lesser and the greater rhea as separate species. This observation of 2 species of rhea, obviously related, occupying different regions, convinced me that they must have arisen from a common ancestor. I saw similar patterns with many of the animals in South America. On the plains of La Plata, we see the rodents agouti and bizcacha, animals having nearly the same habits as our hares and rabbits, and belonging to the same order of animals, but they plainly display South American, not North American or European type of structure. We ascend the lofty peaks of the mountains, and we find an alpine species of bizcacha, the rodent that looks like a rabbit. We look to the waters, and we do not find the beaver or the muskrat, but the koi capybara, rodents of the South American type. The closest taxonomic relatives of an animal are found in neighboring accessible regions and not in inaccessible regions further afield. It is a law of the widest generality, and every continent offers innumerable instances. The most striking and important fact is the affinity of the species which inhabit islands to the species of the nearest mainland, which are not actually the same. Numerous instances could be given. The Galapagos archipelago, situated under the equator, lies at a distance of between 500 and 600 miles from the shoals of South America. Here, almost every product of the land and the water bears the unmistakable stamp of the American continent. There are 26 land birds. Of these, 21 or perhaps 23 are ranked as distinct species and would commonly be assumed to have been created there on the islands. Yet the close affinity of most of these birds to an American species is manifest in every character of their habits, gestures, and tones of voice. I show you 3 of the finches found on the Galapagos at the bottom here, and it has the greatest affinity with this bird from northern South America. So it is with the other animals and with a large portion of the plants, as shown by Dr. Hooker in his admirable flora of this archipelago. The naturalist, looking at the inhabitants of these volcanic islands in the Pacific, distant several hundred miles from the continent, feels that he is standing on American land. Why should this be so? Why should the species which are supposed to have been specially created in the Galapagos archipelago and nowhere else bear so plainly the stamp of affinity of those created in America? There's nothing in the conditions of life, in the geological nature of the islands, in their height or climate, or in the proportions in which the several classes are associated together, which closely resembles the conditions of the South American coast. In fact, there is a considerable dissimilarity in all these respects. On the other hand, there is a considerable degree of resemblance in the volcanic nature of the soil and the climate and the height and the size of the islands between the Galapagos in the Pacific and the Cape de Verde archipelagos in the Atlantic Ocean. But what an entire and absolute difference there is in their inhabitants. The inhabitants of the Cape de Verde Islands are related to those in Africa, like those of the Galapagos are to America. Facts such as these admit of no sort of explanation on the ordinary view of independent creation, whereas on the view I discovered, it's obvious that the Galapagos Islands would likely to receive colonists from America by occasional means of transport, and also the Cape de Verde Islands in the Atlantic by overseas transport from Africa. After returning to England in October 1836, I distributed my collections to experts in the appropriate fields of study. In July of the next year, I opened my first notebook to put down my thoughts on the transmutation or evolution of species. Although I focused my first scholarly writing on my geological researches, particularly my theory of coral reef formation, I thought and read about the nature of the living forms I had observed on the voyage. For the next 20 years, I gathered evidence to develop my theories about how life changed through time. I carried out extensive correspondence with other naturalists and with those who had experience in animal husbandry. I thought that animal breeders sought the means to create new, more useful varieties of animals, so there might be something to be learned from this to understand how new varieties arose in nature. I also carried out an 8-year examination of the living and fossilized barnacles to learn how their anatomy had changed and undertaken new functions over time. This gave me greater insights into the process of evolution. After writing 2 short manuscripts in 1842 and 1844, I began sorting my notes on natural selection in September 1854. After discussing my work with Lyell and others in 1856, he wrote to urge me to begin writing up my ideas so I could take ownership of them. Consequently, I undertook to write my big book, an expected multi-volume work on natural selection in 1856. I received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, a young man with whom I had previously corresponded, in which he described his theory of how transmutation worked. If Wallace had had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract of my theory. My friends made sure that we were both given credit for our theories by having them read together at a meeting of the Linnaean Society in 1858. I was then encouraged by my friends Lyell and Joseph Hooker to condense my work to a shorter abstract to get it out to the public. I did so, and it was published in November 1859 as The Origin of Species. It has sometimes been said that the success of The Origin proved that the subject was in the air or that men's minds were prepared for it. I do not think that this is strictly true, for I occasionally sounded out a few naturalists and never happened to come across a single one that seemed to doubt about the permanence of species. Even Lyell and Hooker, though they would listen to me with interest, never seemed quite to agree with me. I tried once or twice to explain to able men what I meant by natural selection, but I signally failed. As I said, many of the facts supporting the transmutation of species, or as it later became to be called evolution, were in the minds of educated people. Thus, many were convinced by my arguments in the book that species do change. However, some objected to my theory of natural selection. My friend Thomas Huxley did not like the idea that it was a gradual process. He, along with many geologists and paleontologists, saw in the fossil record discontinuities, and so reasoned that evolution worked through large-scale changes. Huxley was, however, very supportive of the natural rather than the miraculous causes of transmutation that my theory described. The random nature of variation, in my view of natural selection, was a major reason for the difficulty of some experienced in accepting the totality of my work. The German naturalist Ernst Haeckel used morphology as an attempt to reconstruct the history of life in what he viewed as progress in increasing perfection. He believed in the acquisition of traits in a Lamarckian manner and thought selection only served to remove the less successful species. A linear line of progression, as opposed to my view of branching, was also promoted by several paleontologists, particularly the Americans, Henry Osborn and Othniel Marsh. Many of these bones had been discovered by Marsh in the Western United States, and their linear progression in the fossil record supported his theory. Even Wallace did not believe that natural selection operated at all levels. He accepted its major role in the evolution of all life, except for humans and their intellectual and spiritual life in particular. One of the most vehement critics of my theories was the famed zoologist Richard Owens. In his published review of The Origin, he claimed that I was too speculative and that I confused the idea that law governs natural processes with the idea that I had discovered the nature of this law. His writing was rather mean-spirited as well. He asked, what is there that approaches an answer to the question of questions in zoology in the entire book? He grudgingly allowed that it contained a few gems, but those were few and far apart. In subsequent years, his arguments deteriorated further into personal ones, and his professional reputation similarly faltered. The problem of blended inheritance caused me a great deal of consternation, as it did several critics, especially the engineer Fleming Jenkin. Jenkin pointed out that any novel character arising in an individual would soon disappear, as repeated matings averaged out that new character. Imagine mixing a drop of white paint in a can of black paint. I was disturbed by this argument and had difficulty addressing it. since I saw variation occurring at the level of individuals. Wallace saved me by clarifying that variation is a phenomenon at the level of populations. In a population, most characters exist over a continuous range. Imagine that tall height is selected for. A population exhibits a range of heights. A tall individual would have half the population to mate with, so that the above average height would result even with blending. Even an individual with a height higher than any other would still produce progeny at the top of the height range and so be most favorably selected. Well, our theory was saved by Mr. Wallace. I understand that after I passed, the theory of evolution remained intact, but my theory of natural selection continued to fall out of favor. Even among those who did not seek theological explanations for the course of evolution, there was widespread discomfort with the idea that a random process of variation, along with individuals each seeking to gain advantage, could result in creatures that appeared so well designed. While developing my theories, I read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations about laissez-faire economics. In it, he wrote that an individual intends only his own gain, and he is in this led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. I see natural selection as such an invisible hand that directs nature towards those characters that best fit each situation. The response of established religion to my book is not what you may have heard. The public that read my book were not largely biblical literalists. For decades, the most enlightened writers in the fields of science and religion had accepted that much of the Old Testament had to be read in a metaphorical sense. Geology had become a sophisticated science. Geological evidence had shown that the formations observed must have taken millions upon millions of years to form. The fossil record was one of extinctions and was almost universally accepted that these successive types of fossilized creatures were generally progressive through the oldest to the newest rocks. No human fossils were known, and hence these ancient worlds were believed to predate the creation of mankind. My book did not shock. Other similar books published decades before had taken much of the heat out of such discussions. Those books were read by huge audiences. Actually, looking at the publication numbers, some of these books sold something like 40,000 copies, whereas all of my editions of Origins sold only 18,000. So these books were hugely popular. And they discussed similar things as my book did. As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln did not read my book, but he had read the 1844 controversial book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. My book did create a stir, though. Some religious writers felt that my views were an attack on the role of a creator in nature and drove a wedge between the moral and spiritual values and the aspirations of mankind. Other religious leaders, however, disagreed with this and said that I had uncovered a new law by which God governed the natural world. I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. On the other hand, I cannot anyhow be contented to view this wonderful universe, and especially of the nature of man, and not to conclude that everything is a result of brute force. I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. The success of the Origin may, I think, be attributed in large part to my having long before written 2 condensed sketches, and to my having finally abstracted a much larger manuscript, which was in itself an abstract. By this means, I was enabled to select the more striking facts and conclusions. I had also, during many years, followed a golden rule, namely that whenever a published fact, a new observation or thought came across me, which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once. I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones. Owing to this habit, very few objections were raised against my views, which I had not at least noticed and attempted to answer. I believe that I have almost always been treated honestly by my reviewers, passing over those without scientific knowledge as not worthy of notice. My views have often been grossly misrepresented, bitterly opposed, and ridiculed, but this has been generally done, as I believe, in good faith. On the whole, I do not doubt that my works have been over and over again greatly overpraised. In dealing with the response to this publication, in spite of an acute sensitiveness to praise and blame, I tried to deal fairly and justly with any unfairness and injustice which was showered upon me, and to listen with patience and respect to even the most insignificant or reasonable of objectors. As I developed my theories, my whole trend of thought was against facile speculation, yet theories flowed freely through my mind, ready for the essential test of observation and experiment. I needed to convince myself by accumulating evidence before I could convince others, and my doubts were as freely expressed as my convictions. But the time is always ripe for the reinterpretation of theories in the light of new vision and of new facts. This is the very province of science. I can only hope that my books lie like stepping stones to future knowledge. Thank you very much for your attention today.
If you enjoyed this video, you might like one of these similar videos above, or one of the other science, art, legislative, entertainment, and humanist videos from HFFC's YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button above.